Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 4 of our reading of A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent. It is a book by Marie Brennan. As always, we'll go over the copyright information first, which is always important because this is not my intellectual property. This is somebody else's. Anyways, this says copyright 2013 by Brennan. Noonschwander. All rights reserved. So, in the last episode, Lady Trent grew up, spent 2 years, kind of putting her passions on hold, and now she's in Fulchester, I guess looking for a spouse. But her brother Andrew took her to the Royal Menagerie, where she has found some dragons, or they have dragons there. And she was asking questions of the naturalist, the royal naturalist. So we are going to continue from there. Okay. At that point, I realized that what I was doing, and I shut my mouth with a snap. Far too late. I fear someone had already overheard from the other side of me. I heard another voice say, "The albino is certainly a runt, and I cannot determine its species. If you wish, gentle reader, you may augment your mental tabulae with dramatic orchestral accompaniment. I suggested something in a minor and ominous key, as that is what went through my own head as I realized just how thoroughly I had outed myself." Let me make sure this is the right page. 49, 50, okay. And as ink nosed, heavy with dread, I dragged my eyes away from the gold dragon and up to the gentleman who had spoken. A pair of trim feet and polished leather shoes. That was what I saw first. Then a goodly length of leg, then narrow hips and a waist not yet thickened by age. One long-fingered hand rested on the sculpted bronze of the railing, shoulders acceptably broad, without being so wide as to produce that triangular appearance I find unattractive, though it appeals to some ladies. A large oval of a face with firm lips, a straight nose, good cheekbones, spectacles in front of clear hazel eyes, topped off with a neatly trimmed cap of brown hair. Another lady, perhaps, might have been able to tell you what he was wearing. For my own part, I viewed him with a naturalist eye, seeing size, conformation, coloration, and identifying marks, and handkerchief tucked into his breast pocket was embroidered with a coat of arms, argent, 3 arrows in band sable. The Camhurst coat of arms belonging to a wealthy baronet. The age and the spectacles made this the baronet's second son, one Jacob Camhurst, 23 years of age, educated at Ensbury, and well situated with investments. The matchmaker who gave his name to my father had marked him as an outside chance at best. He would make an agreeable, if not spectacular, catch someday, but he showed no inclination yet to wed, which was the one thing that saved me from utter mortification. I had not jeopardized any of my good prospects, provided I did not give Mr. Camhurst reason to gossip about me to anyone else. "I beg your pardon," the gentleman said, focusing on me. "I didn't mean to interrupt." He hadn't interrupted. I'd stopped myself before he could. The stopping, however, had left me tongue-tied, a state from which I was saved only by the arrival of my wayward sibling. "Of course not. That's a brother's job," Andrew said, swooping in to offer his hand for Mr. Camhurst to shake. "Andrew Hendamore. My father is Sir Daniel of Norringale in Tamshire. This is my sister, Isabella." My social graces were not the best in those days, nor are they the best now. They have been improved only by the greater dignity of years. But 2 years of practice have rescued me from complete disgrace. I managed a credible curtsy despite the mixture of panic and yearning unsettling my heart. Panic for the man, yearning for the dragons. Most young ladies would feel the reverse. Charmed, I said, as Mr. Chambert took my hand and kissed the air above my fingers. He gave his name in reply, but then turned his attention away from me and back to Mr. Sworgen. The albino, sir? A Vistrani rockworm, the naturalist said. They are naturally gray in coloration. Of course, you are correct. This one is a true albino, as you can see by the eyes. Andrew was making comical faces behind Mr. Cambert's back. I knew what he wanted. What he wanted. It would amuse him greatly to watch me babble on further about dragons. Mama would have fits merely knowing I had been here, though any report of my conduct must be above reproach. If I were wise, I would take my leave of Mr. Camhurst and Mr. Sworgen before temptation became too much. I was not, of course, wise, just as Manda Lewis's impressions of the world had been informed by her reading, leading her to expect balls, duels, and conveniently timed thunderstorms out of life. So, too, had mine, but what I expected was intellectual commerce between equals. I had, you understand, read a great many works by men who regularly experienced such things, and had not realized the unlikelihood of such things for me. In my naive 16-year-old way, I thought Jacob Camshire and I might be friends. Mr. Swearingen closed the matter by including me in his reply to Mr. Camhurst. Miss Hendemore is correct. All three are runt specimens. The green is a moolish swamp worm, and the gold is a desert drake from the south of Achaia. His Majesty would very much like to have full-grown adults, but they could not possibly be kept within a menagerie. No doubt you've noticed the grating that keeps them apart from one another, and at that we've had to keep a muzzle on the swamp worm. He will persist in breathing at everything, and while the other two endure it better than we humans do, no one enjoys it very much. Extraordinary breath? Mr. Camhurst murmured, looking across at the motionless lump of the green dragon. I recognized the phrase from A Natural History of Dragons. It was the term Edgeworth had coined to describe the sixth and final characteristic he considered diagnostic of the true dragon. All such species could expel something additional with their breath, whether it be the legendary fire or otherwise. The general theory for young ladies at the time was that curiosity was considered more attractive to young men than knowledge. Armed with this dubious advice, I ventured a question to which I already knew the answer. What does it breathe? To my disappointment, Mr. Swearingen answered in Mr. Camhurst's place. A noxious fume, miss, he said, very unpleasant and harsh on the lungs. At feeding time, we lower large boards into the gap, you see, between the pins that keeps the worst of it away from the other two when we unmuzzle the moolish for his meal. I imagine the albino would have a hard time of it. In particular, Mr. Camhurst said. Surprisingly not, sir, for the runt and an albino, it's quite robust. Don't let its appearance fool you. The Achaean has the worst of it, but then she's a bit of a dramatic thing. For the first time I noticed that Mr. Swearingen was using gendered pronouns to refer to the dragons. The Achaean, the gold dragon, currently pacing at my feet, was a female. I tried not to stare. Thank heavens the moolish was curled up so I didn't embarrass myself trying to spot anything. An anomaly distracted me. The Achaean was female and the moolish male, but the Vistrani, Mr. Swearingen said, it. I voiced this thought to the naturalist, only realizing that it might be considered inappropriate after I had already said it. What sex is the albino? None, miss, Mr. Swearingen said. Mr. Camhurst had turned his back to listen. I hope he didn't think me scandalous for asking. Rockworms don't. His eyes slid towards me. They don't develop such characteristics, he continued, apparently amending the phrase he would have used, until maturity. The Vistrani remains immature and therefore neuter. This was fascinating, and I wanted to ask more. I wasn't sure how to feel when Mr. Swearingen spotted one fellow leaning over the railing by the swampworm's pen and said abruptly, "Pardon me," rushing over to intervene. It saved me from the chance to ask further inappropriate questions, but it left me alone with Mr. Camhurst. And with my brother, who would have done splendidly as a young lady, at least where the matter of curiosity versus knowledge was concerned. He knew no more of dragons than your average young man, which is to say that they were huge and scaly and had wings, which was very pleasing to the part of him that was still an 8-year-old boy. He began to question Mr. Camhurst himself, which gave us sufficient reason to remain in the man's company until the time came for us to retire to the lawn outside of, and I might add, upwind of, the menagerie. By then, I had managed to address a small handful of other remarks to the man, rendering myself agreeable enough that he obtained a lemonade for me before the ebb and flow of socialization carried him away. Or perhaps it was not my conversation that charmed the man, although I'm sure he was glad to have someone to take an interest in him for some reason other than his wealth. I recall very little of what I wore that day, but I do know I had changed from the bony girl who went after a wolf drake, and the dresses sewn for my season did intriguing things with my bosom. Mamma was displeased to hear where I had gone, and only somewhat mollified by a suitable edited account of my introduction to Mr. Camhurst. His fortune and breeding were both acceptable, but she sniffed at my enthusiasm for his company. Don't waste your time with it. Oh, time where it will do no good, Isabella. I know of the man from Mrs. Rooston. He isn't looking for a wife. I knew better than to tell her that I wasn't looking for a husband, not in this instance. In truth, a part of me felt rather wistful that it was a pity Mr. Camhurst was not on the market. I felt no rushing swell of admiration for him, such as Manda Lewis had dreamed of, but he was acceptably handsome, acceptably personable, and acceptably rich. Mamma might dream of me sharing a certain bachelor viscount, but she would not instruct me to say no if Mr. Camhurst offered. I hoped whatever husband I caught in the end would permit me a friendship with him. He seemed very nice. He seemed a very nice man. That was not the end of my search for a husband, of course. There were dances and card parties, sherry breakfasts, and afternoon teas. All the whirling life that accompanied a season in Fulchester. There were also gossiping mammas, discreet inquiries into familiar finances, and scandalous tales of heritable dementia. All the backstage machination that accompanies the hunt for spouses. Frankly, I prefer the worst of the trials and initiations I've been required to endure in pursuit of my research, but despite my naive intentions, I found myself more and more in the pleasing company of Mr. Camhurst. This culminated in a certain evening at Renwick's, when he asked if he could call on us the following afternoon at our hired house in Westbury Square. Even such a dullard as I could not miss what he meant by the request. I barely had time to stammer out permission before Mama whisked me home and put me to bed with orders that I should not be roused before 10, as it would not do for me to look tired the next day. This was something of a problem for me, as I woke at 8 and was not permitted to rise for 2 hours. I had unwelcome memories of my convalescence from my torn shoulder. As soon as the clock chimed 10, however, everything went into motion. I was bathed and dressed with more than the usual care, and my hair styled to perfection. We ate a tense late breakfast, during which I almost snapped at Mama to take her nerves elsewhere. I cannot pretend I was entirely composed myself, but certainly her jittery behavior put me more on edge. Following the meal, I was sent upstairs to change from morning clothes into more respectable afternoon dress. Mama came with me and chose and discarded 4 possible gowns before the doorbell rang. Looking harried, she reverted to her second selection, ordered my maid to dress me as quickly as possible, and rushed downstairs. The caller was, as expected, Mr. Camhurst, and when I was quite as primped and polished as I could be, I made my way to the sitting room. Mama was there with him, occupied in polite chatter, but she rose with alacrity when I appeared. "I will leave you two to talk," she said, and closed the doors behind her as she departed. I was alone in the room with an unmarried man. Had I needed any further proof of what was about to occur, that would have done nicely. Miss Hendamore, Mr. Camhurst said, stepping forward to take my hand. "I trust you are well." "Yes, quite," I said, marveling inwardly at the inanity of small talk in a situation such as this. As if he heard my thoughts, Mr. Camhurst hesitated, then smiled at me with his while we settled into our chairs. There was, I recall, a hint of apprehension in his eyes. "I'm afraid I do not know the finer points of how this is done. I've not really considered it in advance, but I don't imagine either of us would benefit overly much from my delaying. As I'm certain you've guessed by now, I have come here today to ask you to marry me." Saying it with so little drama might be the most merciful thing I ever saw him do, but it still took my breath quite away. When I regained the ability to speak, unfortunately, my words were not at all what they should have been. "Why, I mean, that is," I blushed a vivid red and struggled to form a coherent sentence. "I apologize, Mr. Camhurst. Please call me Jacob. I don't mean to be rude, and I am dreadfully. It's just that I managed somehow to meet his hazel eyes. All of this had been so strange, the process of finding a husband, and now that the moment's come, I can't help but wonder why. Why do you wish to marry me? Why me? Why not some other? Which is not to say that I think you should look for some other." I quelled myself, shook my head, and said lamely, "I will stop there, before I embarrass myself any worse than I already have." Belatedly, it occurred to me that to pray Mama was not listening at the keyhole with the maids. Mr. Camhurst, understandably taken aback by my words, Miss Hendamore, please call me Isabella. I cannot think how to answer the question without being a little blunt, given how we've begun, though perhaps it's only appropriate." He paused there, and I tried not to squirm. "You've read Sir Richard Edgeworth's A Natural History of Dragons, haven't you?" Heaven preserve me, I said quite involuntarily. Mama will have fits if I answer that question. I succeeded in provoking a fleeting laugh, though it hadn't been my goal. Miss Hendeworth, Isabella, you are not the first young lady to set her cap for me, but I do believe you are the first one to do so, not because of my wealth, but because of my hobby. Unless I'm very much mistaken, you came to Fulchester not in search of a husband, but in search of someone with an interest in natural history, and that was the primary quality that recommended me to you. If Mama was eavesdropping, she would never let me hear the end of this, but at that precise moment I could not imagine lying to the man who might become my husband, even if the frank truth might cause him to cry off. I took a deep breath and unclenched my hands from each other, my fingers cramping at the release. Mr. Camhurst, Jacob, the name felt strange on my tongue and intimate. Had it been the same for him? Natural history has been a passion of mine since I was a small child. It's not a ladylike passion, I fear, and there are few husbands in the world who would tolerate it in their wives. I do not know if you would be one such, but I know at least that you would keep a library on the subject, and I hoped that I might be allowed to read from it. He regarded me with a bemused expression. You want me for my library? But so baldly, it sounded ridiculous. Oh dear, I didn't mean to insult you. This time his laugh was more full-bodied. It's the strangest insult I've ever suffered, if indeed I would give it the name. So Edgewater, then. I was 11, I admitted, the first time I've read it dozens of times since. I see, he said. I didn't hear quite everything you said to Sworgan, but I thought I recognized the name. And you did identify the swamp worm. Of that I was sure. Those dragons, I said wretchedly. I was sure I had made a mall of my entire future, gabbing away like that in public. He smiled, and the sight caused my heart to flutter a little, most ludicrously. Not a mall of it, not then anyways, but there was that other time. My heart changed from fluttering to lurching. Other time? I racked my memory for other occasions in which I disgraced myself. There were so many. Yes, that time just a moment ago when I asked you to marry me, he smiled widely. You still haven't given me an answer. So I hadn't, and after I got over my moment of horrified self-castigation, I swallowed and returned his smile. Miraculously, my voice worked on the first try. Yes, I said. If you haven't run off by now, you're quite possibly the only man in Skirland who would have me. How could I do anything but agree? Pray down. The horn sounded in my head, and this time I was decidedly the victor. Chapter 4. My wedding and a gift. Married life. The great sparkling inquiry. Miss Natalie Oscott and her grandfather. Plans for an expedition in Vistrana. Papa gave his consent to my wedding, and I saw true joy in his eye when I returned home after the season's end. I teared up unexpectedly and could not muster the words to thank him for pointing me at such a chance for happiness, but I believed he understood. The wedding took place in the autumn, just after my 17th birthday. It was a lavish affair. With only the one daughter, my parents could afford to dower me well and send me off in grand style. We had several true August personages in attendance too, thanks to the connections of the Camhurst family, which were somewhat better than my own. My clearest recollection of that day ought to be of my husband, and many of them are, but the one I wish to share concerns my father instead. A bride has few, if any, quiet moments to herself. during the course of her wedding day, but that evening Papa drew me aside and presented me with a small wrapped gift. We have other gifts for you, and your husband has a couple. Oh, and your husband is a couple, he said. But this one, my dear Isabella, is for you. I suspected that what it was even before I removed the paper. My fingers knew the shape inside so well, I did not begin crying, though, until I actually saw the cover of Sir Richard Edgeworth's A Natural History of Dragons. I purchased that book for you, Papa said, despite knowing it might result in trouble. As it has led you to happiness, I believe you should have it. With a fine disregard for the damage my tears were doing to my cosmetics, and also the possibility of leaving stains on him, I threw my arms around my father and hugged him for dear life. As absurd as it may sound, I think that was the moment at which I realized I was truly leaving. This is something the gentlemen readers of the Memoir may not understand, but the ladies will know it all too well. If they are married, they have been through that already, and if not, I'm sure they have devoted some thought to the matter. To marry means to leave one's home for another, and often one place for another. My own experience was not so disconcerting as that of royal brides who depart from another country, but from a family estate. In Hampshire, which I had spent virtually all of my young life, I now left behind everything I knew and removed to Jacob's house outside of Falchester. We are going to stop that right here. We have been reading from A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent. It is a book by Marie Brennan. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.